Good morning. We're continuing our study on the life of Abraham. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 16, and hold that in readiness. Jesus said, in this world you have many troubles. And then he went on to say, take courage, I've overcome the world. Have you ever wondered why God's people struggle so much with troubles and problems when Jesus has already overcome them? You know, we know his promises, but there's a big difference between knowing his promises and trusting in him in regard to his promises. And today we continue that study of the life of Abraham, and he's known as, to most believers, as a great person of faith. Now, I mentioned 2 weeks ago that he wasn't always that way. He wasn't perfect by any means, and that he slipped, and sometimes he wasn't that great person of faith. And once again this morning, we return to a part of his life, a time when he kind of slips and doesn't demonstrate the faith that we have come to know him as being a faithful man. And at this point, you probably might be, if you're really thinking about this message series from week to week and the things that we've talked about, you might be thinking, wow, this message series sure does have a lot about developing faith, about overcoming worry, and now we have doubt. And it seems like, in one sense, these are the same kinds of things. It's true, they are. They all come into play as obstacles, if you will, that keep us from living a life by faith. And so in order to live a life by faith, we must remove the obstacles that get in the way of that. And so today we tackle doubting God, the obstacle of doubting God. Before we read our scripture, remember that Abram and Sarai had given up everything to follow God's promise. You know, whether it was in the land of the Chaldees and then later on at Haran, when they left, they were leaving everything. They left their country, their people, their family. They left it all and to follow God in his promises. Namely, two promises that, number one, I'll give you some land, and then number two, I'll build you into a great nation. At that time, when they left Haran, it was about 10 years ago. Sarai was 65 years old, and Abram was 75. We find it amazing that people like Ron Cook leave out at the early 50s and do something life transformational. But this guy's even older. But today, we just think, well, once you're set in your career, you know, God's done his calling and bidding on your life. But we find that that's just not true, whether it be somebody like Noah or somebody like Abram or even somebody like Ron and Jenny Cook. He could be calling you right now to go do something that seems crazy, not knowing the language, never having been there except 2 little short trips, and that God is now placing on your heart to go and start a ministry. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Go and build an ark. Or go to a land that I haven't even shown you yet. Go to the land I will one day show you. And so just set out and start obeying me. And he does, and Sarah does with him. And so now, though, it's been 10 years since that trek. And that's where our story picks up. Okay, Abram at this point is 85, and his wife Sarai is 75. And the promises still haven't been fulfilled. Boy, how we give up today. We can learn a little bit about tenacity and perseverance. 10 years and they're still hanging on to the promise with not much evidence that it's going to happen. And so we pick up 10 years later, Genesis chapter 16, for our text this morning. So let's discover what we can do to overcome doubt in our lives. Genesis chapter 16 and following. Let's read verses 1 through 4. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children, so go and sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Wow, some things that we do in order to fulfill the promises of God for Him. What do you normally do whenever you haven't realized God's promises in your life and you begin to doubt? Chances are you do the same things that Sarai did. You say, wait a second, really? I would never do that. Yes, let's take a look and consider the reactions of doubt. Sarah's reactions of doubt. First, Sarai's first reaction was to blame God. 75 years old, barren, even though she's been promised a child, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. God's not going to come through. She's a little bit unsettled about it. We can understand her frustration. Frustrations grow as the longer the time tarries. Like when somebody says, I'm late, and then they're even later, and then they're real late, we get frustrated. This is probably how she felt with God. He's late on this one. 10 years of growing frustration. Her frustration grew, but her faith didn't. It could have been growing. Take note of that anytime you begin to get frustrated in life, I'm going to say that period, this is true, but especially frustrated that the promises of God haven't been realized in your life yet, then it's an opportunity. You should see that as a big flag that goes up and says, opportunity for you to grow in your faith. Whenever you start to become frustrated, it's an opportunity for you not to grow in frustration, but to grow in your faith. Even if you're frustrated with other people around you, it still comes back to God because God's got you no matter what anyone else does, says, or doesn't do. God's got you. So it really does come back to the one who said, I am your shield, I am reward. You will never be tempted beyond what you can bear. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I've got you. It all comes back to God. Now for Sarai, this was God's plan. This was His idea. And she claims her situation now is all God's faults. The Lord has kept me from having children. Did you hear it? She blames God, and in one sense, she's right. I mean, if you believe that God is the only one true God and that He is an all-powerful God, totally in control, then technically she's correct. He could have given her a child by now, and so far God has kept her from having a child, and He could have overruled whatever was keeping her from having a child. He could have done it at any moment, but He chose not to. What rubs salt into her wound is that God actually promised her that she would have a child. He didn't have to make that promise. He didn't have to say, hey, I'm going to promise you a child, but He does. But now He promises, and then He hasn't delivered. He didn't show up. Why did He even show up to make the promise if He's not going to show up to fulfill it? He's kept her from having a child. Do you realize that God putting off His fulfillment of a promise that He's made to you has many implications, and it happens for many reasons, I would say. I can't think of them all. I thought of a long list, but the primary personal reason, that is personal for you, is so that He can grow your faith. Do you realize that? That the primary reason God puts off fulfilling His promises to you is to build your faith. Now, there are other reasons, but that's the primary personal reason. It's to build your faith. You see, it needs to be growing. You're not quite where you ought to be yet. Second, Sarai's second reaction was to not just blame God, but was to come up with her own plan. See, you and I, if you've ever found yourself, if you're really honest, a lot of times we cry out and we blame God. We wouldn't want to say that. That sounds really awful. But we know that He's all-powerful and in control, and that He could have at any moment made it go away or make it happen or whatever it might be. But we also then, when we find ourselves in this place of doubt, we react not only by blaming God, but, okay, God, I'm going to have to step up and do your job. If God's not going to do his job, then I need to do his job. And she must do his job. And she said, she reasoned to herself, this is just me speculating, she reasoned to herself that God promised that he would give Abram and me a child, and we're going to become a great nation from this child. And he's told us that it wouldn't be via an adopted kid, like the grown man Eliezer of Damascus. He already told us. But maybe God is going to give us a child through another woman. Now that seems a little odd, right? Maybe his promise is to give Abram a child through another woman, and through another woman that's actually could be a surrogate. In other words, I'll have a child through her, and so maybe that's what. So she comes up with this brainiac idea, and you and I read about this idea, and as we read about it, you probably felt a little something inside of you going, "This ain't right. This just seems weird." Now, culturally, it's really weird, but it just seems like this is messed up. And when we read that plan, we're going, how can a person of God be this crazy? Okay, we need to realize that our plan B is a bad plan. That's why it's called Plan B, B for bad. Our plan B is a bad plan because a plan B is a plan that doesn't include God. And that's always a bad plan. And so she comes up with plan B. And subsequently, she tells Abram, and probably nothing more crazier than her plan is the idea that her husband's dumb enough to go along with it. God's not consulted in this. She tells Abram, and he doesn't, we don't have any record that Sarai consulted the Lord on her plan B. Why should she? God's not in it. She's doing God's job for him. He's dropped the ball. So we're going to step in. And then when she tells Abram, Mr. Man of God, person of faith, he doesn't consult God. We don't have any indication that he goes, well, let me ask God about this one. He had before asked about Eliezer. He cried out to the Lord about Eliezer, like he was in conversation with God. What about, is he going to be the one? God says no. So it's not like he's never even thought about asking God about another plan, right? But here, there's no indication Sarai asked God. There's no indication that Abram asked God. In fact, God's not even in this plan except negatively. The Lord has kept me. Interesting. It's God's plan. And now God is seen as an obstacle for his plan to come to fruition. Isn't this strange? And so she comes up with this idea, and we're all going, hey, Abram, that's a dumb idea. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't care if she came up with it. I know she's your wife. Just because she came up with it doesn't mean it's a good idea. And husbands, you got something in your back pocket right here. Because just because your wife says, hey, let's do this, it doesn't mean it's a good idea. But we all must be careful. We tend to agree to stupid plan Bs whenever we're on the same page with the other person. See, both Sarai and Abram desperately wanted a child. And when you desperately want something, sometimes you agree on stupid plans together. They both wanted a son. One of them comes up with a stupid plan. They both agree on the plan. And they both believed it was seeing God's will happen. Danger. And so they made God the reason for their stupid plan. It's simple. Any plan without God is stupid. Think about this. I think we do the same. When we're desperate and when we're wanting something, we join with someone else that feels the same. We point to God's promises in His Word for evidence that this is God ordained. God needs some help. And we're acting. But don't fool yourself. God's name can be all over your plan. You can drop it in through all out. You can talk about God and all the God talk and all that. But that doesn't mean He's in it. He wasn't in this. And we set out to solve God's problem. We set out to work His plan and to fulfill His promises that He's made to us. We reason that, well, He said it in His Word. He said such and such. So I must make it happen. There is a fine line, friends, between responding in faith and taking steps in the right direction and running roughshod way ahead of God in His timing. See, the one is a faith journey, waiting on God and responding to Him. The other is a doubt journey born out of frustration of not seeing the promises right now. Let's move on to the selfishness of doubt. Sarai's plan seems crazy, but it's not as crazy as you might think it to be. You see, the people in the land of Canaan had certain legal law. They had laws that related to this. If a woman was unable to have a child, she was allowed to take one of her servants and have a child through her for her husband. Now remember, this is before the Old Testament law and all that, so don't go say, well, no. So that was the law of the land. So Sarai was doing something that was legally within her rights to do, and she was doing something that was customarily what the culture allowed. It was within her rights. Just because something's within your rights and culturally acceptable doesn't mean you should do it. We need to hear that again. Just because something's legally within your rights and culturally acceptable doesn't mean it's wise to do it. You see, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians wrote that there are plenty of things that you have liberty to do. Perfectly fine, you have the right to do, but it doesn't mean that you should do them. Those things may be lawful, he says, but they're not profitable. He argued that many of the things that we have liberty to do can cause damage and hurt to others. And that damage and hurt is what is wrong. So be careful about your liberties. While the liberty itself may not be wrong, the exercise of that liberty may be wrong. Do you hear me on this? We don't like to hear that. Well, that's Paul's discussion. Just because something's legal and within your rights to do doesn't mean you should do it, because it may harm someone. I think we see a little bit of that here, but perhaps we have another reason for not exercising our liberties from our text today. We shouldn't do it if it removes our trust from the Lord. I think a lot of times, we might be fooling ourselves that we trust more in someone else than in the Lord. I came up with a test. It's not scientific, but this test is to help us determine if we're living on this side of self. You say, well, what do you mean by this side of self? In other words, are we on this side of self? Are we living selfishly? Or are we on the other side living selflessly? The test aims to determine whether we rely on God's promises for His unfolding story or plan, or if we're relying on God's promises solely for or primarily for personal gain and benefit. And I want to say to you that there's nothing wrong with the blessings and promises of God personally benefiting you. That's a great thing. But if we're solely into the promises of God for what He can deliver for us, then we're on this side of self. We're not like Jesus in that regard. And so I've got two questions to determine where you are on, are we on one side of self, or are we on the selfless way that Christ exemplifies for us? And the first of the two questions is, what is your level and your level and yearning to see lost people come to the Lord? If you had to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you yearn to see lost people come to the Lord? Okay? If you don't have much of a yearning for lost people to come to the Lord, then you're still on this side of self. See, understand that the slow development of God's unfolding plan, right? All His promises is slow to come about, is not meant to frustrate you, but rather He is patient so that others have the opportunity to respond to Him. And so if you're ever others-minded, you get this. But if you're all about yourself, you get really bitter and frustrated. What about me? You haven't done this for me. But understand that his slowness in unfolding the promises is for the benefit of others to come to him. And if we have that in mind, then we understand this. It's not just about me, this slowness. And so how do I know that this yearning of mine to see lost people come to the Lord, and I'm okay with the slowness of the promises being fulfilled? How do I know where I'm at on that? Well, when's the last time you shared your faith with someone? You know, a lot of us, we wish people would come to the Lord just like we want to see the Chiefs win another football game. We do very little to make that happen other than hoop and holler and talk. You understand the difference? And so what I mean is it's important, okay? The second question is this, to decide whether we are on this side of self or not, is that what is your level of longing for the life hereafter? You know, we think about it when we go to a funeral. We think about it, you know, when we realize that this life is temporary, right? We're called attention to that. We think about it when our lives get more miserable. We think about it a lot more. You know, it's kind of like the bath salts, Calgon, take me away. Jesus, come take me away. Take me out of this. And it's all about us. And I'm not saying there's not value in wanting to be delivered. Hurry, come, Lord Jesus. But what about is hurry, come, Lord Jesus, so I can be with you face to face? There's a big difference. Hurry and get me out of my troubles. Come fulfill my needs. Come help me, you know, in my time of despair. Well, come get me so I can be with you. Big difference. We understand that. You can discover this by considering what you spend your time, your energy, and your money and your thoughts on. Are they eternal things or the things of this world? Is Jesus Christ the cherry on top of your sundae, or is he your life? See the difference? I think for a lot of people, he's an adornment to your life. He's like a little few nuts on top, you know, and a cherry, and that's it. But is he the whole thing? Is he your life? And that'll demonstrate that. So understand that there's selfishness behind doubting because the promises of God, because we're running to happen right now. How come you haven't happened? And we're so myopically looking at how his promises might benefit us and not other people. Third, let's talk about the consequences of doubt. Let's continue on with verses 5 and 6. It says, Then Sarai said to Abram, You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. See, the consequences of acting out of doubt can be grave, most notably for a believer. They always make things worse. Understand that. Maybe temporarily for betterment, but they always tend to make things worse. At this point, Abram is surely thinking, I shouldn't have listened to her. This situation's really gone bad. Let me think about what he's thinking at this point in time. Like, I can't win on this. I think Sarah would agree with him, but don't say anything, Abram. Keep your mouth shut. And that's typically what happens when we act out of doubt and try to do God's work. Things get worse. Sarai and Abram thought things were bad waiting on God, but things can be worse than waiting on God. Okay? Abram slept with Hagar. Hagar conceived. I imagine that was quite painful for Sarai to watch. Front row seat to all of this, you know, because especially in a culture where a woman's primary responsibility was to have children, right? And so now she can't, but now even worse, everybody knows it wasn't Abram's weakness, it was hers. Because she, you know, Hagar, she gets pregnant, you know, and it's like, so imagine things got worse here. And then Hagar made it worse by rubbing it in. She despised Sarai. See, the tension in the household just skyrocketed. Now, guess whose fault it is? Text says it's Abram's fault. Is this just a wife upset? I don't think so. You put me in her arms. She said, I put her, even Sarai mentions that. So Abram's response is, I was just doing what you told me to do. none of which would have made things better, but only worse. And Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. And you know what? She's right. But not for the reason you might think. You might be thinking, yeah, if he was a godly man, he would have stand up as a godly leader. And he said, that's a stupid idea. We need to consult God, right? Let's go pray and talk to God about this. But I think that's not a good idea. Or I like the idea, but let's still consult God. Whatever it is, for not doing all that, that's not what I'm talking about. Because you got to understand in the day that they lived in that Hagar was Sarah's maidservant. Her direct authority was Sarai over Hagar. Well, you say, well, then why can't she do something about it? Because she gave her maidservant to be his wife. And so now you got two wives bickering. This is Abram's problem now. She can't just come in and say, had she been able to take care of it, has she been the sole authority over Hagar, I think she would have taken care of it. The frustration is she's not in that position anymore because she gave Hagar, which was hers, to Abram to be his wife. And now do something about it. It's your problem. You're letting her nag me. You're letting her tease me. You're letting her, so it's all your problem. And so at this point in time, he goes, oh, okay. So he gives her back to do whatever she thinks to. Now all of a sudden the victim becomes the victimizer. And she starts treating her harshly, right? And so this is what happens. I don't think Abram wanted to hear about God at this point. She says, you know what? God be my judge for truth. Now, it's interesting. Whenever we step in and try to act without God and do his work for him, then when it goes awry, then we call on God to come into the situation. Isn't that amazing how we do that? Then not only that, he's like going, well, what you bringing God into this, What's God got to do with it? God's never been a part of this except in a negative way. Why are you bringing God into this? And so we have it, the fulfillment of Proverbs. Under three things the earth trembles, for it cannot bear up. A servant who becomes king, a godless fool who gets plenty to eat, a contemptible woman who gets married, and a servant who displaces her mistress. There are consequences to playing God. And when we step in on our plan B, we suffer the consequences. The Lord disciplines us, those that he loves. So let's consider this negative outcome of our story. All the passive scheming, all the negative feelings, all the hurt is a result of Abram and Sarai trying to be God for a moment. It's the same way that you and I go ahead and try to be God. Whenever you step outside God's will, whenever you start trying to fulfill his role, one thing leads to another, and there are consequences. Relationships go awry. The closest of people are at each other's throats, even a husband and a wife, and they all call on God to be the judge. Isn't that the way it is? We go ahead of God. We mess up, and then we want God to fix it. For many of us, that's where our biggest problems originate. They're consequences from stupid actions that we've done before. A lot of things just happen in life. The happenstance of life, I get it. But I think more than we would like to admit, a lot of the things that we endure today are because of choices we made in the past. Now, they could have been godly choices and we got fallout for being obedient to God. I get it. But they can also be the negative choices that we do. See, many people drift in life suffering from one consequence to another, but never recognizing or never admitting that they're their own worst enemy in this. If only they would occasionally ponder their behavior, they might realize that if they had not done that 10 years ago, then they wouldn't be suffering as they are today. Instead, they believe it's just their lot in life. Some people are lucky, they're not. And that's how they see it. They blame others for all the difficulties, and some even blame God. Proverbs 19:3 says, a person's own folly leads to their ruin, yet their heart rages against the Lord. We do well to periodically own much of the consequences that we find ourselves in today. And if we just simply humble ourselves, you know what? The Lord stands ready to help us. If you want help, humble yourself. But before we move on from these consequences of doubt, I must point out the most devastating consequence of doubt. There are echoes here from this story of ours. There are echoes back to an earlier time period at the fall of man. Back to the garden. You see, in both stories, people doubt God's word. This is more evident in the Hebrew, by the way. In both stories, someone comes up with a plan. In both stories, a wife gets her husband to do something stupid. In both stories, a husband is disengaged from the spiritual process. In both stories, a wife takes and gives, and in both stories, a husband takes what she gives him. See, this is all saying from the fall, or here even with the person of God, Abram. When you doubt God. When you doubt God. Even if it's involving someone else, do you not realize, don't you believe He's your reward, that He's your shield? Don't you believe that no matter what that person says, does to you, that you're okay because He's your reward and He's your shield? Don't you believe that God's got your back? He will never leave you, never forsake you. You will not be tempted beyond that which you could bear because He'll provide a way. Don't you believe it? Why are you doubting the whole process? No matter what somebody says or does to you, no matter what you do and stepping in and trying to do God's work, no matter what it is, we just need to come back and realize that our doubt, period, is really about doubting God. And specifically, we can see that with His promises. But I would maintain that it's that way in the rest of our doubt too. I want to close here with a few final thoughts and something to remember. Let's continue on with verse 6. B and following. It says, Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Oh, brother, where art thou? Then the angel of the Lord told her, I'm running from my mistress, Sarai, she said. Then the angel of the Lord told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. Do you think she wanted to do that? The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Sound familiar? Hagar is so severely mistreated that she runs away. She shouldn't have run. She should have submitted to Sarai. An angel comes to her. And some believe that this angel is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. In other words, this is Jesus before He took on human flesh. Remember, Jesus is God and has always existed, even before creation. Okay, so many see it this way. Now, I tend to view that, but it doesn't have to be Jesus here, because the word angel means messenger, and it's an angel of the Lord or a messenger from God with a message of God. Okay, so either way is fine. This message from God is to go back to Sarai and submit to her. Yes, submit. For God institutes authorities over us, and when we submit to them, we submit to God. The angel told her what she should do. Remember, the child is not only hers, but Abram's. And now Hagar's child Ishmael will also have numerous descendants, which this later becomes another problematic consequence for the people of Israel, even to this day. Don't tell me that there aren't consequences to stepping off God's plan. So here it is. Go back, submit, and take this promise with you. Go back, submit, take this promise with you. Here's something for you and I to remember. No matter where we might find ourselves, we can have this encouragement here. Even if we're in the desert, we have no hope, people have done us wrong, or we've done some stupid ourselves, it doesn't really matter, and we're in the thick of the consequences because we've acted outside of God, there's still hope. Go back, submit, and take the promise with you. Go back, submit, and take the promise with you. And understand that that's something that you and I need to get. We need to understand that. Now pay close attention to the following verses. As we continue reading in verse 11, it says, The angel of the Lord also said to her, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roy. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. See, I want you to catch, there's great hope in this naming process, if you will. Hagar responded to God's message by naming God. Did you catch that? Verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. What was that name? You are the God who sees me. Not only is there a God who sees her, but she recognizes that there is a God that sees her. She was then in a desperate situation, and she must have called out to God. But see, we see that God had seen this all along, and he shows up by sending his angel with a message. And then she realizes there is not only a God that sees me, I now see the God who sees me. Now, I want you to think about that, because there are a lot of people that can see that there's a God that sees them. They believe that there's a God that sees them, but that's fundamentally different than personally realizing that, and you see the God who sees you. This is to another level. I think that too many Christians walk around knowing that there's a God that sees them, but not seeing the God who sees them, not personally seeing the God who sees them. When you see the living God, when you realize that he's engaged you personally, that's transformational. I think one reason why God's people don't live transformational lives is they haven't had an encounter with God. They haven't beholded him. They haven't beheld his glory, his holiness. They haven't personally seen. They've heard people talk about it. They've heard others talk about seeing the God who sees them. And so they know of the God that sees them, but they don't personally experience the God who sees them. And so this is what happens. So this encounter, first thing she does is she names God. She gives God a name. What are your names for God? God has a lot of names in the Bible. You ought to be naming. You ought to be naming God. And here she names God. You're the God who sees me. And then she describes herself, you might even say, names herself, I am the one who sees the God who sees me. And then she names the well as, get this, the well is of the living one who sees me. The well of the living one who sees me. So you're catching it. She names God. You're the God that sees me. Then she describes herself or names herself. I am the one who sees the God that sees me. Then she names the well at this location as the well of the living one who sees me. What do you think this is about? God sees. God sees your predicament. God didn't just see her predicament. He saw Abram and Sarah's predicament. He saw their heartache. He saw their grief. He saw their struggles. He sees. It's the God who sees. And that's what we can learn here. That's something we need to remember, that God sees. But it gets even better. See, God's message to Hagar began by the naming of her son. Verse 11, you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. We assume that Hagar returns and submits to Abram. We also assume that she told Abram of her encounter, or else Abram found out another way by God, because in verse 15, Abram names the boy Ishmael as the angel instructed. The name Ishmael means God hears. God hears. The naming process reveals that God sees, but God hears. God hears. The angel's appearance may have been a response to Hagar's prayers. Whenever you might be, whatever trouble you might be in, always remember, never forget that God not only sees you in that predicament, but He hears you. He hears you. I imagine Abram and Sarai figured it out. When Hagar returns, think about the story, right? Hagar, an Egyptian woman, returned to the place of her captivity with the story of her encounter with the angel of the Lord. And her story revealed, God sees and God hears. Subsequently, Abram named his son God hears. And subsequently, every time someone called the boy's name, they were reminded that God hears, God hears. And every time they heard the boy's name, God hears, God hears, they were reminded of the fact that they failed to call upon the name of the Lord. They failed to ask God for help. See, 10 years earlier, they asked God about it, but now they forgot. See how comforting it is to know that God sees and God hears? See, through the corridors of time, Abram and Sarai have a son, and his name is Isaac. We're told that Isaac and his wife Rebekah found themselves in the same predicament. They couldn't have a kid. But this is what we're told in Genesis 25. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Could it be that simple? I wonder who he learned that lesson from. Probably mom and dad and his half-brother running around. God hears. God hears. This morning I'd like to invite you to make a decision. I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward. That whenever you encounter doubt, number one, look at it as an opportunity for you not to grow in frustration, but for you to grow in your faith, that God is doing a work in you. Realize that His blessings and His promises, although they might be directed to you, they're not just for you, because they pass on and they benefit others through us. And so keep that in mind. But always remember that God is not unaware of what you're going through, the struggles, the difficulties, the heartache, no matter what it is, because He sees. He's very aware. But He also hears. And I believe that God is waiting for you to reach out to Him, to call upon Him. And so as we stand this morning, as we sing our worship song, I invite you to make a decision to if you've never trusted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, why not today? Why not today? And the rest of you that have, why not today? Begin the day that you start living on the other side of self, more fully so, to strive to be more like Jesus, who is willing to give up everything for the benefit of others. And so come as we sing.